Another draft economics video. I'll try to fix the kind of a mess I made of the last one. Yeah, it's not quite as bizarre as I described. Fractional reserve banking is basically just inevitable banking. You really can't have a bank any other way. I mean, theoretically, it wouldn't make any sense if somebody had to hold your deposits and they couldn't do anything with them. Then how could they possibly pay you interest? Because all they would do is watch your money get less valuable in a year and say, I'm going to give you back less money because your money got less valuable just sitting in our vault over there. So obviously the money has to be doing something for a bank to have any reason whatsoever to pay anybody to put their money in the bank. In the old days, like when this fractional reserve thing first started, what was happening is what individual banks could write their own money. All right, and when that was going on, I was sort of thinking of the current system in that context, and it really isn't the same thing. Because in those days what would happen is the bank would basically, it would be basically the producers, kind of, the movie The Producers, where they basically oversold a play, and then they say, they sold 100% of the profits to, 10,000 people, and so obviously if the play is a success, there's no way they could pay the people back, and the only way they could make money is if the play fails. And the same thing was happening in banks. In the old days, they would just print more notes than they had in deposits and just lend them out so they could make money on the interest. And as long as everybody paid back everything, they could get away with it for quite a while. But if something went wrong and somebody didn't pay back something, well, then there was a disaster because they had no deposits to cover the loans. And so they had no way to pay back people who might want their money back. So I guess some of the current, crooks in the stock market were playing the same kind of games in a way. So anyway, getting to, I'll get to a chart. Nick the Modern Mystic, he did a video, and that was nice. Nick hasn't done a video response to me in quite a while, pointing out that I got it sort of wrong. I mean, in the end, it's the same difference in the sense that when money's put into a bank can end up loaning it more than once in a way. They could take your money, loan it to somebody, the money ends up back in the bank as a deposit by somebody else or by even the person who borrows the money. Part of it might end up back in the bank. They can reloan that money, so there is a multiplier effect, but it's not as draconian as I was perceiving. So anyway, here's an old chart. I'll try to make it full screen, and it sort of just shows, from 1910 to present, what has been how much cash the Federal Reserve has printed. And so here's to the year 2000. Year 2000 was $571 billion in cash in circulation. And so it doesn't sound like a lot. I mean, it's a lot of people. It comes out to $2,075 for each person. And that even sounds, it doesn't sound like much. There's only $2,000 worth of cash per person in the world, in the United States. It's not a huge amount of cash. So anyway, but from this chart, it's sort of interesting because in 1930, it was the only year that there was actually a dip. So it went from $53 per person to $36 per person. So the Federal Reserve, somewhere in there, was actually burning cash, dollar bills, instead of printing more money and putting it into circulation by buying bonds, by buying U.S. debt, actually paying cash for it, printed cash, but cash nonetheless. That's basically how the money's put into the system. So it's not as I thought, where the banks were just given money. The money's actually created to buy assets, and then those assets are held by the Federal Reserve, and at some point in the future they might make those assets available again to the public, which in turn sort of burns cash, because whatever cash they take in from that transaction would be destroyed. So anyway, over the years it's basically doubled every year since 1940. It didn't, not during the 50s and 60s. It was kind of stable. but since 1960 there's been basically a doubling of the amount of cash every 10 years that's put into the economy. So that would indicate a 10% inflation, but there hasn't been 10% inflation per year. At least we're not told of that number. And I think the real difference is, and you can sort of see it in these numbers on the other side better, if you can read them, is that what's happened is that inflation hasn't been 100% every 10 years. So it hasn't been 10% inflation. And where the difference is in how much money ends up consolidated by the wealthy. So instead, when they give you a per capita number of $2,075, that number doesn't mean it's equally distributed. It just means that's what the per capita number is. And what has happened is say if we had 30% inflation in the last 10 years, the 70% that these indicate, that there should be from these numbers, has gone to the wealthy. So the wealthy people, they have real earning power that has increased, real wealth that's increased, while the average person hasn't. So you can sort of think about it in terms of buying power. I mean, what this chart basically says is that, what $34 bought you in 1910, $2,075 will buy you now. Well, the real number might be something like $1,000 for most people, because their real earnings and the amount of capital they're holding hasn't increased as much, and the real world inflation that they're existing in hasn't increased that much. But the wealthy have gotten much wealthier, and so that's sort of what this chart to me indicates. All right, so the other chart I wanted to show was the current. This is the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, and I don't know if you can read this either, but it's saying now that the total cash in circulation is $903 billion. So that old number was 5 something from 2000 and from the year 2000. So it's basically doing the same thing. By 2010, this number will probably be $1 trillion. So it's about doubled again. The real interesting feature of this chart is where we'll see where the Federal Reserve, instead of using cash to buy bonds, they're essentially have borrowed the money. And so there's different places you can see where numbers from year over year have increased substantially, and there's two here, so that's 500 billion in those two there. And the key one is further down here on this chart. This is the money that they have, that the reserve banks, the member banks, have deposited with the Federal Reserve at no interest. And that number grew from nearly nothing to $819 billion. So they've basically just borrowed the money from the member banks, which seems interesting just because the member banks, I would imagine, are the same banks getting bailed out in some respects. So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If they have this extra cash to deposit with the Federal Reserve, why do they need cash? So it's kind of bizarre, but this is the way the Federal Reserve is playing the game, so it can avoid having to print more cash and put it directly into circulation. So it's finding this backdoor way to extract some cash so it can buy U.S. bonds and thereby keep the interest rates low. But it's just eventually this money will have to be paid back, so the money is going to have to be printed, or somehow there's going to have to be some huge economic gain or something that would allow them to reintroduce bonds or some other vehicle to collect cash that they can, essentially burn again or whatever, destroy. So anyway, so that's, I guess, enough of this. Sort of interesting, so I'm going to try to figure out more of this stuff and how it works. But the bottom line is fractional reserve banking it's necessary. I mean, it's just the way it has to be. You can't. There's no other way to run a rational bank. I don't think, because there's no you have to make money do something. So I mean, essentially all banks have to be some form of savings and loan. I mean, there has to be an expectation that, yeah, you you should be able to get your money back, but maybe you can't get it back immediately, because basically you are part of the business. You're giving them money and saying, loan it to somebody, make some money, and then give me part of the profit. If it didn't work that way, you wouldn't bother putting your money in the bank. So it's not as nasty a word as it sounds, or its reputation has become, and it's really not running the same way as it did in 1710 or something, or 1392. There's not as much room for that kind of real shenanigans. So anyway, it's not the bogeyman. The evil has been deficit spending by the federal government, 13-14 trillion of it, and huge consumer spending that they, as a practical matter, can't pay back, and that's what's done us in. But anyway, we'll do some more of this some other time. So hope I fixed what I made a mess of, and hope I didn't create more confusion. And I'm out of time. Perfect.